This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Hey, this past week I had a debate. I sat down with Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, and he and I had a debate on Ukraine. What should, if anything, the United States do? Johnson and I disagreed on a lot. We come at this from very different places, but we had a really engaging, rambunctious, respectful conversation. That's what this is all about. That was this past week. What you've got here is about 2 hours, hour and a half to 2 hours of a debate with me and Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson on Ukraine. It was sponsored by ZeroHedge, ZeroHedge.com. Interesting group. They're on the right, but they're trying, I give them a lot of props, they're trying to bring people together, right? And have conversations like White Flag, right? Have conversations between people who do not agree. So check this out. Me and Ron Johnson debating on Ukraine right here. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you to ZeroHedge.com.
Welcome to everyone from the Zero Hedge community and from Senator Johnson's Twitter and my Twitter page, and I think you've kindly retweeted the show. So welcome everyone to this debate. It's an issue that I consider to be the most serious at the moment, yet not getting the attention it deserves. Ukraine is losing ground, struggling with ammunition and manpower, while the West debates how much more aid to send. Russia's preparing for a new offensive this year, while Ukraine is likely hunkering down behind defensive lines and trying not to lose ground. It seems that Russia can sustain the war for longer, and Western support for Ukraine is showing cracks as well as capacity constraints, especially when it comes to artillery shells. The war's death toll has been devastating, to say the least, and Putin experienced his biggest challenge to his rule that many of you forgot, and that's a mutiny last year, even though it only lasted 24 hours. Ukraine is struggling with manpower, as I said, with the average age of Ukrainian troops at the front line now at 43 years old. I think the US is about 25. In his annual State of the Nation address last week, Putin again warned of a nuclear war. Today, we're glad to have Senator Ron Johnson with us, as well as former Congressman Joe Walsh, for this debate. And they will both help us understand the current state of the war and the path forward that we have, or the multiple potential paths forward. Senator, I would like to start with you. Again, pleasure to have you, sir.
Glad to be here.
As the only member of Congress, if I'm correct, to have attended Zelensky's inauguration in 2019, how has your perception of Zelensky, as well as the Ukraine war today, changed since 2019, especially since the invasion 2 years ago?
Well, first of all, I think let's get on the table what we all agree on, I would imagine. We all think Vladimir Putin's an evil war criminal. We all have a great deal of sympathy for the Ukrainian people. They're fighting for their families, for their country, for their freedom. They were invaded. There was no reason for Putin to invade. I think it is interesting when I not only attended his inauguration, but I went back to Ukraine a couple months later with Chris Murphy. I had been either the chairman or ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations European Subcommittee, so I've made about 7 trips to Ukraine. And what was interesting, particularly in the second meeting, might have been in the first as well. First of all, I think Zelensky was absolutely dedicated to defeating corruption. I think it's the real deal. He was a political neophyte. The Long Knives were out immediately, so a very, very challenging task. But I thought what was interesting, now this is in 2019, Russia has already illegally annexed Crimea. They've already come into and occupying eastern Ukraine. But even at that moment, Zelensky recognized he had no chance of dislodging Putin. He knew it wouldn't be popular, but he told me, he said he was dedicated to doing a peace deal with Putin. So he can move on, focus on corruption, focus on integrating further with the West. So I have to give him an enormous amount of credit for having the courage to stay, Remember the Biden administration, I think they were ready to have Ukraine capitulate right away. I mean, offering him a plane ride out of there. Had he taken that plane ride, I think Ukraine would have collapsed and Russia would be in total control. But he didn't do that, even though he knew Russian assassination teams were after him, so he stayed there. So the courage of the Ukrainian people is just unquestioned, and that's why I think Americans have so much sympathy for them. But I started laying out what I think is the reality over a year ago. The sad reality, it's an awful reality, I hate it. Vladimir Putin will not lose this war. Losing the war is existential to Vladimir Putin. You talked about the coup. He has nuclear weapons. He threatens to use them. But the fact of the matter is, Russia has 4 times the population. They have a much larger industrial base, a much larger military industrial base. They can produce 4.5 million 155 millimeter shells at a cost of $600 a shell. The West, we're struggling to produce 1 million a year, and it costs us probably an average $5,000 to $6,000 per shell. I mean, that's kind of a discussion for another day in terms of our military industrial complex.
I didn't know that price discrepancy was there as well. I know the production capacity was there.
10 times. We have quotes from Zelensky's inner circle saying, yeah, send us all the weapons you can. We just don't have the men to fire them. You mentioned the average age of Ukrainian soldiers, 43 years. So again, I don't like the reality. The only way this war ends is in a negotiated settlement. I'm not going to like the settlement. Ukrainians aren't going to like it. But every day that goes by, the settlement gets worse and worse and worse because more Ukrainians die, more Russian conscripts die. I take no joy in that. These are people yanked out of their villages, sent to the front lines to be cannon fodder in this bloody stalemate. And more Ukraine gets destroyed. So I think U.S. policy should be directed toward bringing Putin to the negotiating table, not fueling mindlessly a bloody stalemate. When I hear people like Senator Schumer come out of the White House meeting and say, this is simple. If Ukraine gets the $60 billion, they win. If they don't, they lose. How are they going to win? I mean, I've been in secure briefings. There's no strategy that I've heard of how you actually defeat Vladimir Putin. Russian people support this war. The only way you grind them down is if you start offensive operations into Russia and you start making the Russian people. We're not going to do that. We can't risk nuclear war, which is one of the reasons the Biden administration in the West hasn't really provided the kind of weaponry Ukraine would need to push back more effectively. So again, we're in this bloody stalemate. That's not going to change. This war needs to end. I don't like that reality, but that's basically been my position.
Senator, I've got a lot of questions, and I'm going to start off with how did we get here? But before that, Congressman, just your initial thoughts on what the senator's mentioned, what he calls the reality that we're facing now that you've been talking about for over a year now. Would love your general thoughts on this before we get into the questions.
It's interesting. Senator Johnson and I agree a lot on what the reality is right now. We may have a disagreement on what to do moving forward. And it's great to be here. And again, Ron, as I came into this, and Mario, it's great to be with you. I didn't think of this as a debate. Like I thought of this if President Biden put you and I in a room and said, figure this damn thing out. The reality, Ron, that you've just expressed, figure out what we need to do. I agree with Senator Johnson. Russia won't lose if it's just Ukraine. If they're fighting Ukraine, they're too big. Putin doesn't give a fuck about life. He'll just keep throwing bodies out there. That is the reality. Russia, we can talk about what victory means, and I think there are a few different scenarios. Russia could ultimately lose if it's Ukraine and the West. And the West has to make that decision. How committed will they stay and to what end?
When you say Russia could lose, and this is going to be a question for later, but I will touch on it briefly now. How do you define winning or losing in this war?
It's a great question. And I think from Ukraine's perspective, and most people, Ron, I think would say this isn't realistic. Ukraine grabs back all of its territory, including Crimea and eastern Ukraine. That's publicly what Ukraine will say. Get Russia out of my country. Again, and Senator Johnson nailed it. We gloss over, you didn't, but we gloss over the context. Putin's a fucking thug who invaded a sovereign country. That sovereign country wants to fight for its sovereignty. Let's not dismiss that either. Is it our place to say, Ukraine, you can't keep defending your sovereignty? So that would be Ukraine's ideal victory. I think there's a secondary victory from Ukraine's perspective, that the Russian government changes and Putin's out of the picture. I think from the West's perspective, and I'd be curious what Senator Johnson would say, I think our perspective, what does victory mean? It means that as much as possible, Russia is pushed back. As much as possible, Russia is weakened to the point where they can't do this again, and we avoid any nuclear or major NATO or Russian confrontation. That, I think, would be victory from our perspective.
And Senator, before I go to you on the same question, just want to remind the audience, when there's reality and there's what we would like to see. So for anyone, we'd all love, I assume, for Russia to be outside of Ukraine, completely out of Ukrainian territory. But when you have an assessment, came out by the New York Times last week, in October 2022, the US intelligence assessment said that they put the odds at 50-50 that Russia could launch a nuclear strike to halt Ukrainian forces if they breached its defense of Crimea. So I've got very close people in Ukraine I've helped evacuate. Yet I know what the reality is. I was in Ukraine weeks before the war as well. And that applies to anybody that talks about the war. There's reality and there's what we'd like to see. Senator, same question before we dig into what got us to where we are today. How would you define a Ukrainian win or a Russian loss?
Again, I just want to end the war. Another reality is yes, Ukraine claims that territory now. But as Vladimir Putin, in his interview with Tucker, gave the long history of really what Ukraine was, it's the borderland. There are certainly Russian-speaking people in Crimea and eastern Ukraine that would prefer being governed by Russia. I mean, that's also reality. So it's one of the reasons they were fighting. It's one of, obviously, Vladimir Putin's concerns as well. So I do think it's important to understand what the other side's perspective is. It's interesting if you go back in history and you listen to the conversation and read the conversation between James Baker and Gorbachev. Baker was very concerned. This is as they're talking about reunifying Germany after the fall of the Soviet Union, and this is the 1990 time frame. Very concerned about Russian perception of, should we keep U.S. troops in there? Should we do it on our own or as part of NATO? Very concerned about pushing and not necessarily giving an ironclad guarantee so there's nothing in writing, but sensitive that we're not going to move NATO to the east. Yep. We've done that a lot. And so you have to understand the other person's perspective in all this. And so to me, victory is just a cessation of the hostilities, a negotiated settlement. I would love to have been a fly in the wall in Istanbul a couple of weeks after the war started, when they were already signing different, various aspects of a peace agreement, and Boris Johnson, airdrops into that thing, and all of a sudden that agreement is blowing up. You had the Minsk agreements. Again, I'm not privy to those things, exactly what happened, but it would have been nice if we could have ended that war then. But by the way, I would also add, I think we could have prevented Putin from invading. I think there are a couple of things we could have said. We're going to respect the fact that you're concerned about NATO on your border. We're not going to offer NATO membership. We could have put UN troops as a tripwire. I don't think he would ever have considered invading Ukraine if Trump were president, and had there not been the embarrassing and dangerous surrender in Afghanistan that showed how weak America was. So again, there's a whole, multiple steps in history that led to this. But now we've got this mess, and this mess just has to come to an end.
I'd quibble with my good friend on Trump. I think Trump would do whatever Putin told him to do. And I think, though, forget about that for a minute, Ron. I think you and I would agree, maybe not, so I'll pose it as a question. I mean, Putin's objective here is to reassemble the Soviet Union. Putin considers Ukraine Russia. He's made that clear. He made that clear before he invaded. His Security Council came out a week ago and said, there's no sovereign Ukraine, that's Russia. So that's his victory. So what's Putin's victory? He takes Ukraine and then he continues to take what he wants to cobble together the old Soviet Union. The interesting question, Ron, is do we have an interest, or what is our interest in trying to stop that?
So let me just say, I don't buy the argument that you've got a domino effect. I mean, that's what we use as justification for Vietnam. We never should have gone to war with Vietnam. JFK was right. We should have pulled those troops out, and you would not have had the domino effect and communism taking over the world. It wouldn't have happened. We should learn from that history. I think Putin has got to recognize that he thought he could just roll into Ukraine and take it over. I mean, he has been bloody. This has not been a success for him. You really think he's going to go up against NATO, invade a NATO country, and come against our armament? Again, we've withheld the good stuff, you know, the powerful stuff, the air support, all that type of thing. I don't think Putin is that stupid, quite honestly. But my main question is, we've done a terrible job of looking back in history, retrospectively, and just asking the question, what has been the result of our foreign entanglements? How did we get from glasnost and perestroika and the fall of the Soviet Union and a real concern and meeting the minds between Gorbachev and you know, Baker and Bush in terms of, you know, what can we do to cooperate with you guys to you know, get rid of your nuclear stockpiles, to denuclearize Ukraine? You know, how did we let that relationship completely degrade, as opposed to, you know, integrating Russia into the West like we've allowed all of Russia's satellite nations to integrate?
Why do you think that didn't
what
happen?
happened here? Well, again,
Putin.
no. Well,
Come on.
listen. I think the U.S. military-industrial complex is not helpful. I don't think our intelligence agencies are helpful. And again, we're the good guys. I think American people are good. I think we have been misserved by people in power, and I think you have to really ask those questions.
I think it's important. You can be critical of people in power, yet still be pro-America. It's not like every time someone's critical to Ukraine, they're pro-Putin, or critical to any three-letter agency, they're anti-US. I think just putting people in those baskets is wrong. And talking about the military-industrial complex, Congressman, you have the worries, in your opinion, that Putin could proceed beyond Ukraine. Yet considering we have Sweden and Finland just joined NATO, and you have Putin couldn't get to Kiev, he thought he'd be there within days or weeks. Do you really consider Putin crazy enough to invade more countries than just Ukraine?
I think we would do such a gross disservice if we underestimated how bad, how evil, and how crazy he is, yes. Look at the colossal mistake he's made with what he did 2 years ago. Ron's right. Mario, you're right. Putin probably thought he could take over Ukraine in 2 days. He messed up. He's concerned about NATO. Well, thank you, Vladimir Putin. Thank you for what you did to NATO. NATO's never been this unified. NATO is expanding. NATO is stronger. Member countries in NATO are paying more for their defense and for assistance to Ukraine. Ron and I probably agree on a lot of issues because I'm not a neocon, and when I was in Congress, I agreed that we spend way too much on defense, and I don't want America to be the world's policeman, and I don't want to do all the nation building. Ron and I agree with a lot of that stuff. What's so interesting about this is Putin didn't invade a NATO country. If he had, there'd be American boots on the ground right now. No questions asked. And Putin invaded a NATO adjacent country, a country that would like to be into NATO, a country that would like to be into the EU. So what would he do beyond that? And by the way, the expansion of NATO, that's the other contextual element here. Putin wants to grow his empire again. NATO is expanding. That's a good thing. NATO upholds peace. It's a security alliance, right, for all countries who want to be free, respect the rule of law. It's a good thing that Eastern European countries want to be in NATO. But, Ron, I don't know your opinion on this, and Mario, I don't know yours. When Russia invaded, what should we have done right away? Or should we have done anything?
Well, first of all, I mean, I supported and voted for the first $40 billion tranche for two reasons primarily. I was hoping that if Putin would see a unified West, again, having failed to take him over, he just, okay, let's end this thing. And by the way, that's what might have been happening in Istanbul until Boris Johnson screwed it up, probably at the behest of the Biden administration. Again, I don't know what happened there. So that's one factor to consider. The other thing I would point out is, you take a look again at the arc of history here. I was all for freedom-loving people at the Maidan, wanting to exercise their freedom and turn toward the West and integrate economically. But in hindsight, and again, I meet with European delegations to this day, and I'm not going to rat them out in terms of the ones that say this, but I ask them a lot of questions. And I ask them, to what extent was the U.S. involved in fomenting that? And I get pretty honest answers. Well, it always takes people on the ground, but those people need help. So you have the Rose Revolution in Georgia. That is threatening to Russia, so then they invade. And so now they occupy parts of Georgia. You have the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, 2014. You have the Maidan. They force out Yanukovych. Mm-hmm. I think Putin was happy with Ukraine, with Yanukovych, somebody who's, they call him a puppet. It's hard to say. He apparently democratically elected. You always have to question those elections. But again, it was when he got toppled that things started turning south. And then, Putin realized, well, I've got my Black Sea fleet in Crimea, I better protect that. We've got these Russian-speaking people more aligned with us, invade eastern Ukraine. Again, all I'm saying is what precipitated this, and as much as, just in your heart you support people that are yearning for freedom and rebel that way, that revolution of dignity, when all said and done, hasn't turned out well for Ukraine. Again, that's what I'm saying. You have to look retrospectively at what was the U.S. role in this. I mean, is there a better way of supporting freedom-loving people as opposed to fomenting a revolution, toppling a regime that is going to be reacted to potentially very strongly by Putin?
Ryan, Congressman, I'm just going to play a quick clip, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Congressman. So in 2014, and just for people in backstage, just prepare the clip of Newland, the infamous recording. In 2014, prior to the ouster of then-President Yanukovych, and during the Maidan Revolution, then Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, as you mentioned, Senator, was captured on a phone call plotting the composition of the new Ukrainian government. I'll be commenting on it. I want the clip to be played briefly, and Senator, Congressman, I think you'll be able to watch it here, and I would love to get your thoughts on it.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here.
So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week.
Klitschko has been the top dog. I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three. I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Just to give the audience context about this recording, and I'm sure Congressman, Senator, you know what I'm about to say, but a couple of months prior to this leaked call, Klitschko was by far the front runner to become the president of Ukraine. And Yatsenyuk, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, was significantly lesser known. As you heard in the call, Nuland said she preferred Yatsenyuk over Klitschko, and Klitschko should go into government. Weeks after the call, less than a month, I think, after the call, Klitschko drops out, and Yatsenyuk, if I'm again pronouncing it correctly, becomes prime minister. I'm going to go to you right after, Senator, because you were in Ukraine not long after that. But Congressman, based on what Senator just said about U.S. involvement prior to any war and prior to the ouster of Yanukovych, and that could have played a role in leading to the invasion we're dealing with now.
And I will not say, as others have said, not about you, Ron, that you don't believe that we caused Putin to invade.
Do we play any role?
I think, no. I think the expansion of NATO, again, the context here, the Soviet Union breaks up. Eastern Europe begins to go their own way. Eastern Europe wants to become a part of the West, part of freedom and liberty and the rule of law. That's certainly something that I think we should encourage. They want to become part of the EU and NATO. The EU and NATO, we are the good guy. I mean, nobody's a total good guy here, but we are the good guys. Putin is the bad guy. So the fact that a lot of these countries wanted to be part of where the good guys live, again, it all comes down to our national interest. Is it still in our national interest? I think it is. But of course we should encourage that. And yeah, real politic. Are there times we go beyond just encouragement? Sure. But again, the overlay here, and then you can go to Senator Johnson, Putin was hell-bent on doing this, period. This is step one, period. I don't know about a step 2 or 3 or 4, but they consider Ukraine Russia. His criteria for not invading, when NATO and the West did all they could with Putin, publicly and privately, once the troops were assembled on the border, don't do it. Putin demanded that Ukraine remain neutral, and Putin demanded that NATO go back to pre-1997. I mean, go back decades and get rid of the NATO members of the countries who've joined. That's untenable, and that's not something we should have agreed to.
Senator, you were with Nuland in a June 2014 delegation to the inauguration of then President Poroshenko. First question is, were you aware of Nuland's activities, which many perceive, or to me it's relatively obvious, many perceive as meddling in Ukrainian politics?
Yeah, no, that is an uncomfortable level of meddling. I would just quick ask the question, what is the CIA doing leaking all of its stations in Ukraine right now to the New York Times? That didn't just happen by accident. By the way, if you're Vladimir Putin, how would you view, and by the way, he knew that before we knew it. I'm sure he's fully aware of what CIA stations are operating within Ukraine. When I first went to Ukraine in 2011, Yanukovych was in power, just beating Tymoshenko. And the whole U.S. effort there was, how do we help Ukraine rid itself of the legacy of corruption? Corruption in the wheat markets, the oligarchs controlling the media. We always talked about that. I thought that was kind of interesting because, America has oligarchs in media too. We just call them billionaires. But that was the whole effort. Then you have the Maidan. After the Maidan, it was all about, okay, now how do we help the Democratic elected? Again, I didn't realize we had this level of meddling. From U.S. senators, just okay, how do we help them break free of the Soviet Union and break free of the legacy of corruption? That would have been the whole effort. I had no idea of the CIA stations there. And again, you have to understand, how does Putin view that? How would we view that? We didn't take real kindly when in the Khrushchev, when Khrushchev put nuclear missiles in Cuba. I mean, we almost went to war over that. Again, I'm not saying we were putting nuclear missiles in there, but we're setting up spy sites. Again, that's not the actions of a friendly nation that is trying to allow Russia to integrate with the West. It becomes more and more hostile, and that's the whole point I was making. What happened from 1990, the spirit of glasnost and perestroika, to the point now we're back into a proxy war, another Cold War with Russia, and we're talking about, what, a 50-50 chance of, I don't necessarily agree with that, of a nuclear conflict? I mean, something's gone terribly wrong here that we ought to analyze, what role do we play in this as well?
And Ron, that's healthy, but you make it sound like you're putting so much of the onus on us, when the context here again is Putin.
Again, I said up front, Putin's an evil war criminal, had no justification to invade.
What?
But from his perspective, we're poking him in the eye with a stick all the time.
You don't consider this poking in the eye?
I don't consider that poking in the eye. I consider that countries like Ukraine and these other Baltic state countries, free of the Soviet Union, right, now wanting to be part of the West, wanting to be more free. Again, our role should be, as much as possible, we encourage that. We'll maybe quibble over how far we should encourage that. Realpolitik is a part of that, and we always got to be vigilant against that stuff. But yes, when you're dealing with countries that want to be free, and then you've got this guy Putin who's trying to grab them and pull them back, I think it's in our national interest to try to stop that.
Congressman, just before we go to you, Senator, Congressman, if we found out that Ukraine shares probably the European country that shares the biggest border with Russia, if we had the same thing happen in Canada, for example, where Russia was meddling in Canadian politics and playing a role in who becomes prime minister, how do you think the U.S. should respond, and do you consider that prodding?
If Canada was part of America, part of the United States, and Canada broke free, like if we had a big American Union here, our whole hemisphere, and Canada broke free, and Mexico broke free, and they wanted to be free and sovereign nations, and the United States said, no, screw that. We're going to invade. We're going to try to take Canada back, take Mexico back. And Canada and Mexico turned toward Putin. If he was the good guy in this scenario and says, help us, I would think Putin and other countries would help. Countries trying to be free, sovereign countries.
Senator, how much of an impact, and you kind of hinted at that answer, but he's asking you more directly, how much of an impact do you think this meddling had on Putin's decision to eventually invade Ukraine? Or, you know, Mr. Walsh said, or Congressman Walsh said, Putin was hell-bent on doing this anyway.
Well, I don't buy that, okay? I know that's what we're being told. And I'm not a Putin apologist here. Again, he's an evil war criminal, okay? I'd like to see him held accountable, but again, he's not got nuclear weapons.
What do you think his intentions are?
But again, I know we're always told he's going to try and remake the Soviet Union because he's made statements. It was the greatest tragedy. You know, from his perspective, it was. But one thing that I'd ask all the listeners to do is review Eisenhower's farewell address. It's famous. It's only 15 minutes long. It's available on YouTube. It's famous for obviously warning about the military-industrial complex, which I don't think we've taken that warning seriously enough.
Agreed.
He had 4 warnings, though. He also warned us about government funding of research, how that would create a scientific technological elite that would drive public policy. I think we saw that during COVID. Warned us about plundering our children's future. We've completely ignored that one. But I thought he spent the least amount of time, but I think this is maybe the most prescient warning he gave us. He said, we cannot allow global society to descend into a terrible state or a state of dreadful fear and hate. And if you think about the elites, you know, what they're doing, they are always pushing fear and hate. Climate change, the pandemic, Russia, China, okay? Again, I have no problems with Russian people. I have no problems with Chinese, you know, folks from China, probably even North Koreans or Iranians. I have a problem with their leaders. And I think in many cases they are evil, okay? But I think U.S. foreign policy ought to be not whipping up the fear, try and do everything we can to lower the temperature, to create less tension in the world, not always be saber rattling. That's kind of what I hear in Congress is saber rattling. You know, we got to turn our attention to Asia.
Ron,
you know, let's go to war over Taiwan. My God.
Do you think we purposely saber rattled so that he would invade Ukraine?
I don't know what happened.
Do you believe that?
I don't know what happened.
Well,
I don't know what happened. I know I didn't know about the CIA bases. A U.S. senator, I had no idea they were doing that.
Do you think America
I don't know anything about.
No, do you think America wanted Russia to invade?
I can't get the truth about Metabiota and the biolabs. I can't get the truth on that. All of a sudden, that was sold, and all those records are gone, and they don't share them. Joe, what I'm saying is I've been doing investigations into the federal government now for, since I became chairman of Homeland Security.
And you've done
the federal government lies and lies and lies.
Completely
They're completely opaque. So I'm sorry. Again, Americans, we're the good guys, okay? But our government has done some pretty bad things, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of these things.
What I've always loved about you, like me, gets us both in trouble. You're a straight shooter. Do you think the American government purposely set out to do a bunch of shit so that Russia would invade Ukraine?
I don't know. What I'm saying is, I'm asking the question: how do we go from 1990 and people writing about the end of history,
the Soviet Union broke up.
Here we are, 30 years later, and we're talking about a proxy war and possible nuclear conflict. So whatever. Yeah. Somebody screwed up that relationship. Somebody screwed that up.
The Soviet Union broke up. An evil, thuggish dictator took over Russia and said, I am going to get it back.
When did he say that?
Said that early after he took over.
He said his greatest tragedy. I'm not.
And so, but again, I want to try to believe what they say. I want to believe Biden when he says generally something publicly, that's his intention, or Trump, that's his intention. This has been Putin's intention from day one. Period. So we have to react to that, and that's what makes this conversation fascinating. How do we react to that, or is it in our national interest to just do nothing?
No, I think the way we reacted to it was proper in terms of prodding our NATO allies to actually defend themselves, to spend what they should spend.
And they've stepped up.
A little factoid here. Again, these are last year's numbers, but the U.S. spent $880 billion on defense. China, the next big spender, $200 to $300 billion. Now, they get more for the money. That's not exactly an accurate number, so I don't know exactly what China, but they are building their military big time, okay? The next 13 nations combined, I think it's less than $700 billion. The next 13 nations, that includes Russia, they spend about $100 billion. That's England, that's France, that's Germany. If you're another world power and you see America spending that much more in defense, setting up CIA bases right next door to you.
There you go again.
No, I'm just saying. What are you thinking? I mean, do you perceive that as a threat that maybe you need to push back on? Again, we're the good guys. Yes, Americans are good. We want the best for people globally. Okay,
I get that.
But again, I think our foreign policy in many cases has been very misguided.
And I appreciate the distinction you make that the American people are the good guys. Completely agree. But much of what you've said for the past 30 minutes is that our government is the bad guy. And you've acknowledged that Putin's a bad guy, but you've spent 27 of 35 minutes going after our government instead of going after what Putin and Russia's government. Russian people
but when you say like we all agree Putin is mainly to blame, and I think this is something we agree on. Where we disagree is what role does the U.S. and does NATO play, and I think this is why this is the focus.
Now. Or, yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
So Putin is to blame. And I think the focus is, well, how big of a role did the U.S. and did NATO play? And I'll ask that question after reading out a quick blurb about one of our sponsors. But how big of a role did NATO play in leading to where we are today? Because this is the point of contention that we all have. I'll wrap up this segment with a couple more questions about what got us here. So, Senator, in August 2022, you voted in favor of this latest round of NATO expansion, which includes Sweden and Finland. That triples NATO's border with Russia. Putin has blamed NATO's expansion multiple times, including not long before the invasion, as one of the main causes of the Ukraine war. In your opinion, does NATO share any of the blame for the situation, if you touched on? But more important, because you've answered that one already, more importantly, what do you think happens next now that Finland and Sweden are part of NATO?
Again, I've always viewed NATO as just a purely defensive organization, okay? But I know Putin doesn't view it that way. So I think as you expand it, you do have to be careful, and particularly, James Baker understood that when he was talking to Gorbachev. Finland and Sweden, I mean, that's a defensive move on their part caused by Putin's, brutal invasion. So, I was going to support that as well. What's on the table right now is, should we send another $60 billion down to fuel a bloody stalemate? I would prefer that this not be a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. I have no problem with the nations that, where Ukraine's in their backyard, NATO nations. They've awakened. They're going to start spending more on defense. They just committed another $54 billion to this. I think that's fine. That they should. I think it's less risky if it's European nations that are funding and fueling this stalemate than the U.S. You may say that's not that big a distinction, but I think it is. And I think our policy ought to be, to the extent we supply support, is it should be in a way that's going to convince Putin that this is going to be another Afghanistan. This is going to be a long, drawn-out slog. This is going to be guerrilla warfare, and we ought to be. And that's why very early on, before Putin invaded, I was all for providing. Things like sniper rifles, that type of thing.
You voted in favor of the $40 billion.
Drones, that kind of stuff. Yeah, and I did that to signal to Putin. Plus, a lot of that money went to restock our own stockpile that was
Exactly.
being depleted. But I will say it's a pretty depraved justification for the $60 billion when I hear congressional leaders say, well, that's really not going to Ukraine. That's going to create jobs in America. I'm sorry, that's a depraved justification. I mean, the extent that we're depleting our stockpile, we need to be concerned about that. But I would ask, what are we spending $870 billion a year? Why is every military operation always have to be a supplemental?
Agreed.
And by the way, which we never pay for.
I agree with
$60 billion, I haven't heard any Democrats say, well, what we'll do is we'll pay for this, but we're going to spend less on our green energy boondoggles.
We agree
Okay?
on that. When it comes to spending, Senator Johnson, I agree on almost all of that. First point, I got a lot of notes, and I so appreciate how informed and learned you are on this issue, and I mean that with respect. Ron said something interesting about a few minutes ago before the break, because this is an interesting thought. When Russia invaded, what do? And you said generally we did the right thing. We began to throw some support. The other options at the time, Mario, were to do nothing, or to stump our chest and put our troops on the ground, put NATO right there on the border, and really risk a confrontation. I think generally the United States and the alliance threaded that needle well. NATO, again, I'm a broken record, it is a good thing. We should be loving NATO. We should be embracing NATO. We are part of NATO. It is a peace-loving, security-keeping alliance. That is a good thing. It is a good thing that countries want to be a part of NATO and, by the way, the EU. So now what? Now what do we do? And by the way, NATO, self-determination. These countries decide they want to be in NATO. The Ukrainian people, 86% of them, want Ukraine to belong to NATO. Each country has to approve this. And by the way, the Ukrainian people want to fight to the death. You and I may think, Ron, that's crazy. But damn it, we forget this. This is their country. What next? How do we, both Ron Johnson and Joe Walsh would like to end this. I think the quickest, best way to end it is to give Ukraine more aid now, as much as we can, as big and fast as we can, so Russia, as quickly as they can, pays on the battlefield, and Putin, in whatever kind of a demented mind he's got, says, I need to sit down at the table now.
Senator, you've voted against the recent bill for more funding towards Ukraine. I think it's about $60 billion, which passed the Senate. Just very broadly, why? You voted yes for the first one. You did say that Biden has no strategy. There's no strategy by the Biden administration to end the war. So I'd love you to elaborate on this.
There you go. That's the rationale.
But what strategy?
But let me just quick. What Biden administration did before the invasion, they completely blew it. Now I remember talking to Wendy Sherman before she went over to Ukraine, and this is the intelligence reports coming in and they're massing troops. And I said, well, Ms. Sherman, are you going over and telling the public how much lethal defensive weaponry we are transferring over to Ukraine as a deterrent? Oh, Senator, we don't want to get in a arms race with Russia. Well, then you're not going to deter them. That was a real mistake. When we saw those troops massing, we should have immediately called up Lavrov and Putin and go, what can we do to stop this? This is in nobody's best interest.
Why do you think it didn't happen?
How do we know it didn't happen? Have we heard it happened?
Has Ukraine declared neutrality, which arguably could have prevented this war?
Why should Ukraine choose neutrality
and not join NATO
if they don't want neutrality?
By the way, because yes, a country can want to join NATO. NATO doesn't have to let them join.
No, I
because
get that,
we
Ron.
are making a huge commitment. A lot of people want to join NATO because we don't spend money on defense.
Well, no,
a mere 2%. So
okay, that's not fair. And you and I can work we can work at them paying more. And by the way, Putin has got them to pay more.
That is one huge commitment on the part of the United States to let a new country into NATO, particularly one that is right there at Putin's border where you could end up with a real mess.
But again,
it's something different, Montenegro or North Macedonia versus Ukraine.
Again, you're Ukraine, you're Poland, you're whoever. You've got the West, you've got Putin. You now have your sovereignty. You've got internationally approved your borders that that Putin grabbed piecemeal. This is your country. You get to and want to clean up corruption, decide where you want your country to go. And if you have a country knocking on NATO's door saying, I like what you have, I believe in the real rule of law, I believe in freedom, I'd like to be a part of this good guy alliance, we certainly listen or we encourage it.
So this is how I'd like to view the world. You have the American people, you have the Russian people, you have the Chinese, you've got the people of the country. They would probably like to get along. You know, what can we do to get our leaders to figure out how to get along?
Well, but
okay,
Ron,
instead of pushing this, you keep pushing things.
No, I agree with you on that, but man, all we can do is control our leaders. What can the American people, the average group of people living in Peoria, Illinois,
Joe, that's why I'm asking these questions. I don't know what our leaders do. I don't know what's being told. I don't know what bases are being set up. I don't know what stations are being set up. I don't know, because our agency heads aren't honest with us.
We have a mechanism in this country, thank God still, to at least try to hold our leaders accountable, called elections and other things. There's no way the American people can hold Putin accountable, just like there's no way the American people could have held Hamas accountable for what Hamas
Joe, let me
did.
ask you, do you know how popular funding Ukraine is right now, the American public?
Oh, no,
you know how many people are calling my office saying, Senator, vote for this?
Completely.
So maybe every now and again, the American people are right to question this.
No,
okay?
Ron, I agree with that. I'm just saying the kumbaya notion that the Russian people and the Chinese people and the American people should all come together, and that's the way I view the world. I'm sorry, the Chinese people and the Russian people are not free. They do not have that luxury that you and I have. The best we can do, if we want to make the world a better place, the American people, is elect people. We keep an eye on our government. We should be more vigilant, but elect people who will represent our interests.
Again, what I've learned 13 years in Congress is the government doesn't allow us to keep an eye on them.
Oh,
no,
completely.
Joe, they don't.
Completely.
When it comes to covert operations, no, we don't have a clue. Don't have a clue.
Congressman, so I'm going to read out a quote here that they just sent me.
Oh, jeez, what did I say?
Putin said, and was prior to the invasion of February 21st in 2022. Quote, "We were open, sincerely ready for a constructive dialogue with the West, and said and insisted that both Europe and the whole world needed an invisible security system equal for all states. And for many years, we suggested that our partners discuss this idea together and work on it. Implementation. But in response, they received a distinct or hypocritical reaction. This is about words, but there were also specific actions. The expansion of NATO to our borders, the creation of new positional areas for missile defense in Europe and Asia. They decided to hide behind us with an umbrella. This is the deployment of military contingents, and not only near the borders of Russia." And then I want to link to some more quotes here. We've got a top Ukrainian diplomat said, quote, "Putin did everything possible to make peace." That wasn't too long ago. The head of the Ukrainian delegation said, quote, "We could have ended the war had we just declared neutrality." Last April, Ukraine rejected a Russian peace deal requesting Ukraine to declare neutrality and not join NATO. Senator, you've stated that Zelensky wants a peace deal at the beginning of the war. I think you stated that.
This was right after he got elected.
Oh, okay.
Again, he wasn't going public with that. He was just telling us that I know it won't be popular because, again, Russia had invaded. And there were, but again, understand that it's not I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that a lot of people in Crimea preferred being ruled by Russia. Same in terms of Eastern Ukraine, and that's a basic fact.
But that doesn't justify. In your mind, that doesn't justify Russia taking Crimea. But Mario, to your quote, again, I don't mean to offend. I'm not offending you. I don't believe a damn word Putin says. Putin in 2021 demanded demilitarization of all countries that joined NATO in the past 30 years. Putin said that. Putin demanded that. Putin demanded Ukraine be neutral before the invasion. Putin did that. Demanding another country be neutral? What gives Putin the right to...
Even if Ukraine was neutral, he would have still invaded Ukraine?
Some of the reporting says that, I could be wrong, Ron, that a month or so after the invasion, Zelensky said, a ceasefire for neutrality. Putin, if you want us to be neutral, that for a ceasefire. Some of the reporting I've seen, Zelensky offered that a month into the war.
By the way, I don't disagree that you got to take everything that Putin says with an enormous grain of salt.
It's like Hamas.
I don't disagree with that at all.
Who's going to believe a word that a Hamas leader says? I mean, I'll acknowledge that, and thank God there are people in our government, like Senator Ron Johnson, who keep a watch on what people...
But if we don't listen to Putin, the other side, it just becomes our own echo chamber.
No, right. Thank God there are people like you watching what our government says and does. But my God, when it comes to dictators and thugs, yes, we can't believe damn near everything they say. I'm sorry. That's just a lay of the land.
So do you think if it's true, if Ukraine could right now declare neutrality, which means not joining NATO?
I think that window left.
But if it still exists now, because it was apparently in the I think it's Istanbul and Belarus peace negotiations, if I remember correctly, if that still stands, do you think the U.S., which obviously influences Zelensky's decision, should accept that?
No, I don't. And by the way, I don't think Putin at this point would take it. If Ron Johnson and Joe Walsh said, "Stop fighting, and give me some sort of settlement or agreement tomorrow," it would be a really bad agreement for Ukraine.
But it seems to be getting worse as time passes.
Yeah, let me finish the thought, Mario, and that's a good point. Right now, any kind of agreement right now would be bad for Ukraine, because what's Putin going to do? Walk back from the 18 or 19% of Ukraine they've got under control right now, not including Crimea in the east? That's not going to happen. So any kind of agreement right now is a victory for Putin. I think an agreement's got to come, but an agreement's got to come after we've pounded him more on the battlefield.
So again, the reality situation is the administration is looking for $60 billion, and what I'm saying, at a minimum, okay, exactly how are you going to spend it? And enough of this fantasy, like Schumer came out of the White House and said, well, $60 billion, they win. Yeah, how? I mean, tell me how that's going to happen.
Agreed.
And of course, they're not telling you how. So if you want any funding for Ukraine, tell me how you're going to spend it to try and bring this war to an end.
So your problem is not the funding. Your problem is the strategy.
It's kind of, if it was paid for, I'd have a lot less problem with the funding.
Yeah, but
again, I want to know exactly how it would be spent, and I want it paid for.
It's again, we're I think the word you used was depraved, so I don't want to walk into that again. But we're talking about $60 billion. We're talking about 5% of the defense budget. We're talking about 1/10% of the discretionary spending budget. And I'm all about, Ron, our debt and our deficits like you are. But you and I both are smart enough to know that when it comes to our debt and our deficits, it's got nothing to do with what we're giving Ukraine. It's got everything to do with entitlements in this country that we're afraid to wrap our arms around. So it's not the money, it is how we spend it, and most of what we've given Ukraine, we're not writing them a check. Most of it is simply weaponry and armament.
But then it has
by
to
the
be
way, quick
hey, which is not necessarily a bad thing, not a bad down payment now, if you think a bigger, badder European war is coming down the road. Go ahead, Ron.
Quick little side, I'm an accountant, so I really pay attention to the budget. In 4 years, you talked about entitlements. In 4 years, we increased other mandatory spending, not Social Security, Medicare, other mandatory spending, $711 billion. Who's asleep at the wheel in terms of Republicans negotiating all that stuff?
And Mario, we don't want to get sidetracked, but Ron just made an amazing point. When it comes to the debt in this country, the biggest and fastest growing piece of the pie is all the health care costs for the American people living longer and longer. You could get rid of the Defense Department tomorrow, and it would not impact our debt and our deficits.
Joe, what I'm just saying is in 4 years, we increased other mandatory spending.
Completely.
And basically by what we spend on defense.
Another issue, and both parties are horrible at it.
But again, that's why $60 billion unpaid for is an issue.
Senator, Congressman, it's a question for both of you. One of Zelensky's close aides told Time magazine that even if the U.S. and its allies come through with all the weapons they have pledged, all of them, exactly, quote, we don't have the men to use them. And as I said, the Ukrainian soldiers' average age is 40, 43.
So another, I think, interesting quote, I think this came from the defense minister, said he completely underestimated the Russians' ability to withstand casualties. The Russian defense minister said his fault. He said, I completely underestimated Russia's capability of sustaining.
Despite historically this being the
case.
I
mean, Stalingrad, 1.1 million people. I mean, they held off Napoleon.
Well, that's easy.
I thought that's what was interesting about that Tucker interview. Again, I spent a lot of time with President Vucic from Serbia, long dinners. And what I found fascinating about that conversation with Putin is it's the exact same approach to educating you. It goes through the long history. And it's a millennia worth of history. There's a reason they call Russia the motherland. That's what Russians, that's how they view their country. So again, it shouldn't surprise anybody that they are going to fight, and they've got the capability of withstanding all kinds of casualties.
Mario,
that's why I say Putin's not going to lose this war.
But Mario, the other issue is Finland and Sweden, on Russia's border, are now NATO members. I don't want to provocate. I don't want to get Putin all worked up. Should we get rid of that? Should we take that away? That's a lay of the land.
That is Putin's fault. That isn't something that Putin can say, this is what the West pushed on me. I brought this on myself. Okay, that's calculation.
That makes him less likely to give up any territory in Ukraine, considering he just lost
that
with Finland and Sweden.
I would agree. That buffer.
He won't.
But look, let's say he gets the weapons, though, Senator. If Ukraine gets all the weapons they want, what's the solution to not having enough men? Obviously, Macron said.
So they only conscript down to the age of 26 because they have a real shortage of men. I don't know, a large percentage of Ukraine's population left. Again, Ukraine is being destroyed. If you're concerned about the Ukrainian people, you have to consider what's being done to their country right now. Okay, and again, I have no doubt the Ukrainian people are unbelievably courageous, and they will fight to the death, and they want to fight. But
so then, Ron, and you and I agree on that. So there are a lot of important questions, Mario. One of the most important questions is, so what do we do now?
No, I know. So right now what's on the table is $60 billion. I'm opposed to it in the current form, not paid for, no explanation of, okay, what are we going to actually do with that? Remember, we're withholding the weapons that could be more effective against Russia. I mean, go talk to Biden about that. I mean, what kind of discussion?
I agree.
I mean, should we be threatening more the shipping? Their Navy, that type. Ukraine was pretty effective in doing some things and sinking some ships.
Ron, you could argue
again,
we should
I
have
think our strategy needs to be to show Putin this is going to be another Afghanistan long-term guerrilla war and get out of here.
Oh, I kind of do too, Mario. But then how do we do that if we don't give more aid to Ukraine?
You're not going to get that with just giving Biden a $60 billion check. A man who, Robert Gates, said has been wrong in every foreign policy. And again, a man who completely blew the pre-invasion.
Right. But let's stay focused on the question before us. How are you going to get Putin to think, oh my God, this is another Afghanistan, I got to sit down at the table? To me, the only way you don't do that by saying the U.S. is pulling back, we're not going to give any more money. That's going to make Putin just smile and go, boom, I beat him. I beat him.
I concede that point. It's a real concern. But again, Europe just ponied up another $54 billion. I don't think we're at that stage. That $54 billion ought to be to buy the types of weapons, the type of capabilities to prove to Putin that this is going to be ugly for you and come to the negotiating table. Again, I don't serve on armed services. I'm not a military guy myself. But the overall strategy ought to be show that Putin that this is not good for you long term.
Mario, they're rationing ammo right now. It can't just be Europe. We're all part of the alliance. We should be bigger and faster. You could make an argument, Ron, that from the beginning, Biden should have been bigger and faster in what we gave Ukraine. From the beginning, I think he should have. But at this point, Mario, the only way he's
still the general in charge.
You have to.
He's the guy that's going to be wasting the $60 billion.
You have to. But again, okay, my friend, the senator from Wisconsin, forget the $60 billion. Let's not give him anything else. What will that do to Putin?
I think.
Yeah, I mean,
I think we both. I can see that point as well. I think it's a valid point, despite me sharing your concerns, Senator. But I want to play devil's advocate here. Ukraine has stepped up attacks on the Russian territory. That includes oil refineries, steel factories, an airbase housing Russian strategic nuclear fleet, and even a drone strike on the Kremlin itself. Would you be okay if Ukraine ended up using those U.S. weapons to attack Russian territory, and what do you think are the repercussions of that?
No, I wouldn't. I want Ukraine to use what we give them to do everything they get to take back the territory that Russia stole from them. Yes, just that.
Without attacking deep into Russian territory.
Absolutely. And this, again, this is what we have to encourage. We all conceded the point that if the U.S. walks right now, and again, 60 billion, Ron, I get it.
No,
then does that?
I think what might happen is Europe will have to step up to play even more, and that wouldn't be a bad thing. You know, I'd rather, if this is going to be a proxy war, it's really not a proxy war when Europe, Ukraine's in their backyard. They have a reason to fight. This is, when we're supplying it, it's a proxy war.
But we'd agree, Europe cannot fill the void.
And
of
Europe
US
has stepped up. U.S.
Would you agree with that?
Europe.
Europe in total is the same size as our economy.
But militarily.
No, I mean, part of our problem is in the West we can produce about 1 million.
No, Mario.
1 million a year,
Mario,
155 millimeter shells versus Russia 4.5 million.
That's a real important point you just made. The U.S. is better equipped to give Ukraine armament. Europe's better equipped to give them just money, finances, resources. But again, though, if you want to bring Putin to his knees, you can't pull back now. The only way you're going to put him on his knees if you spank him as fast and hard as we can, as quickly as we can to try to end the fighting.
They've had 2 years to do it.
But then Ron,
they've had 2 years to do it.
Okay, what's my answer? My answer right now, and then I want to hear yours. My answer is go hog wild now and give Ukraine every damn thing we can give them militarily to help them push back Putin and bring Putin to his knees so we can negotiate a settlement. If we keep drip, drab, and drag this out another year or 2 or 3, we're done. What's your solution?
That's a valid point.
Well, if there was a strategy to do that and then communicate that with Putin, go, this is what this is what's coming at you if you don't sit down and negotiate.
What strategy? So you keep referring to strategy, and you've mentioned it in previous interviews.
What
would that strategy look like? What should it look like?
Well, again, I've said it repeatedly.
Peace negotiations.
You've got to show Putin that this is going to be a bloody stalemate for him as well, and not worth his time.
We both agree. We both agree. But you think we should focus more on the peace deal?
Again, we're dealing with the Biden administration. They're just going to suck down the money. They're going to waste it. They're going to be as slow as they've been. Again, it's been 2 years. They've gotten a lot of military support. They haven't won the war.
Well,
okay?
Ron, the flip of that is it's been 2 years, and everybody at this table thought Russia would take over in a weekend. And Ukraine has held tough and fought like MFers. I mean,
but there's the concern.
They fought to a draw.
Then there's supposedly the summer offensive that went nowhere.
Right, but
now they're back on the
they
heels.
fought
Again,
this thing to a standstill.
We're funding General Biden. And
peace negotiations are going nowhere as well, Congressman.
Well, they haven't even been attempted.
So then, again, I love you like a brother, but then that means because Biden's president, we have to wait until the November election to see if the other guy will win before we give Ukraine any money. It is what we have. And I think our strategy, Ron, if you and I could advise the president is, here's $60 billion, here's how you need to spend it, let's go bigger and stronger and faster.
Yeah, but we don't even discuss that. That's the problem. Joe, you know how grotesquely dysfunctional Washington, D.C. is.
Yes.
We get secure briefings. They tell us nothing. They don't lay out a strategy. They say, $60 billion or, we lose this thing. $60 billion, we win. Again, that's not a strategy. That's just BS.
I want to try to get you to compliment Biden once. Do you think on this level he's done a good job in assembling a coalition, an alliance to fight back against what Russia did?
I would say that was a pretty easy lift.
No, but did he do a pretty good job bringing the coalition
That was an
together?
easy lift.
That's kind of a compliment.
Gentlemen, Trump could become our president very soon. Senator, in December 2016, you signed on to a bipartisan letter with Senators Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and Marco Rubio, calling for then-President-elect Trump to send, quote, lethal assistance to Ukraine. Defensive weaponry to Ukraine. This was something President Obama had resisted. By the next year, Trump would approve sending Javelin missiles to Ukraine. Why do you think that was the right policy decision at the time? And what would it take? And I kind of touched on that before, but I want to dig into it a bit further. What does it take specifically for your stance to change again now?
Well, again, that was a defensive stance. That was deterrence. And I'm all for deterrence. That's why, again, you achieve peace through strength, so you show strength. One part of this, a component of the $60 billion debate is when that supplemental was first raised, people started making the very valid point that before we send $60 billion to help Ukraine secure its border, we probably ought to secure ours. And whether you like it or not, the fact of the matter is that was the only leverage we had against Biden to secure the border. Keep in mind, President Trump, with the authority that exists in law, the Supreme Court said our current law exudes deference to the executive. It's been weakened by some court decisions, but even the weakened authority that Trump had, he secured the border. Biden used that exact same authority, 95 executive decision or executive actions to dismantle all that and open up the border. So Biden has the executive authority to secure the border. He just doesn't want to. And nobody, except for, I think, McConnell, nobody in the Republican conference that really spoke out was looking for an immigration bill. We were looking for some enforcement mechanism, recognizing that Biden was a lawless administrator, a lawless administration, a president that ignored Supreme Court rulings. And we were just saying, what can we do to force Biden to use that executive authority to secure the border? And so we used the Ukraine funding bill for that leverage. It's valid leverage. I mean, you may or may not like it, but that's part of the component of the $60 billion debate.
We could talk for 4 hours on the border. We'd agree with a lot. Point one, we can do both. Right, a country as big and strong as ours, if we
but
have,
Biden won't.
Hold on, if we have the will, we can do both.
But Biden won't.
This whole notion of House Republicans saying,
but Joe,
no.
Biden won't, and Biden won't give us a strategy on how he's going to use the $60 billion. So I'm somewhat reluctant to vote for it.
But say America is good and great enough that we can do both, protect our border and help Ukraine. Point two, you said peace through strength. Completely agree. Mm-hmm. Let's keep doing that.
Starts with economic strength.
It also, military strength is a part of that.
Yeah.
We've set a course with Ukraine. We can continue down that course. We could heighten that course, or we could walk away. I guarantee you, the only road that Putin would respond to is if we heightened and strengthened that course. Otherwise, Putin's going to wait this out for the next 4 years. Putin is banking, Mario, on the 2024 election. Putin wants Trump to win. We can get it. If you want to spend time on that, we can spend time on that. Donald Trump, more than almost any other issue, has talked about, dreamed about, laughed about, yelled about disbanding NATO, getting out of NATO. There is nothing on this planet Vladimir Putin would like more than to get rid of NATO.
He said in Tucker's interview, quote, there will be no fundamental change in his opinion in U.S. policy if Trump becomes president.
Who said that? Putin? Who was interviewing him? Tucker? Oh boy. Oh boy. Did Tucker have a big old tough follow-up? I don't believe a damn word Putin says. Putin tried to help Trump get elected in 2016. Putin wants Trump in the White House. But before we go down that rabbit hole, the point is Donald Trump has given every indication he wants us out of NATO. He wants to break up NATO. It comes down to that. I believe, most people believe, NATO is a force generally for good and for peace and for security.
So what Joe Biden done is he's been in charge of an administration. Every policy action he's taken has basically weakened this country. And our adversaries notice it. I mean, the open borders weakens America. I mean, the military-age men coming in from China, 150 other different nations, weakens this country.
Should you,
40-year high inflation. A dollar we held at the start of the Biden administration is worth 85 cents. The war on fossil fuel, the embarrassing and dangerous surrender of Afghanistan.
Ryan.
I mean, you talk about peace through strength. It starts with national strength, not necessarily military strength. That's the final piece. And everything that Biden's done. So I mean,
it's not the final piece because it's right in front of us right now. We have a war in Europe. Biden has helped strengthen NATO. I give Putin all the credit in the world. But what's happened is NATO right now is stronger and more unified and larger than it's ever been. Ron, that's a good thing, right?
Listen,
is that a good thing?
The nations of NATO have been harangued
for
years and years to up their game in terms of
concentration.
Answer
that question.
Should the U.S. leave NATO?
No.
Should NATO exist?
I think it's kept the peace for 70 years.
Is it a force for good?
I believe it is. But you have to be very wary of where you expand it, and you've got to be sensitive of the other person's perspective. And again, I don't think we should be expanding it. And I like the Secretary General of NATO, but when he said Ukraine will eventually be part of NATO, said, well, that's not a good way to get Vladimir Putin to a negotiating table. Okay.
Common ground, Mario. You're doing a great job. You're bringing these two together.
I don't think we're ever that far apart.
NATO right now is stronger and more unified than it's ever been. NATO is a force for good. Expansion is generally good, but we need to be careful about how and where we expand.
I'll show you how far apart you can be, though, Senator. Congressman, you said the following, quote, "Make no mistake, Trump is telling us what he'll do. If he's president again, Ukraine will not receive a dime from the US. Trump will be Putin's best friend. He will root for Russia, and he's hell-bent on getting America out of NATO. But I'm going to mention some facts, Congressman. Would love your thoughts. And Senator, I'm sure you strongly disagree with this. In his 2022 speech before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin listed many grievances he had with the American administration's policies over the years. And many of his complaints are things that happened during the Trump administration. I'll give you 4 examples, Congressman. Trump approved lethal military aid to Ukraine, which again Obama was against, not to provoke
By the way,
Putin.
that wasn't just one point of clarification, Mario. That lethal aid to Ukraine came with some real tugging from Trump. Remember, Trump didn't want to do that, and then Trump tried to dish up dirt on his future political opponent to get that taxpayer-approved aid. So Trump had to be talked into doing it, and it got him impeached. But continue.
I'll let you respond to that, Senator. Right after, Trump did approve granting Ukraine's enhanced opportunities partner status, which again is a step closer to joining NATO. Trump approved large-scale U.S. military drills in Ukraine, and at the time, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo established a bilateral strategic partnership with Ukraine that reaffirmed Ukraine's eventual membership into NATO. Essentially, you could say, based on what Putin said, and based on our discussion so far, Trump played a role in some ways, and not alone, and Senator, you might disagree with this, in Putin eventually invading Ukraine. Putin himself even said that Trump, quote, imposed the greatest number of sanctions on Russia. So despite all these facts, could you still call Trump pro-Putin?
Oh, God, yeah. And again, Ron asked me at the beginning, or maybe you did, Mario, would Putin be crazy enough to take Ukraine and then move into Poland or somewhere else, or Finland or Sweden? And I'd said he's maybe crazy enough to do anything. I have no doubt that Vladimir Putin would say whatever he has to say to help Donald Trump get reelected. And I have no doubt that Vladimir Putin would say, oh my God, that Trump guy, Mario, he was the toughest SOB, that Trump guy. I have no doubt that Putin would say stuff like that. Absolutely. Boy, quit believing what these people say. You are so good about not wanting to believe our own government. I don't believe a damn word Putin says.
Yeah, as I said, you have to take everything he says with an enormous grain of salt. You know, I concede that point.
But on the point, do you think Trump is pro-Putin?
No, I think Trump is very pro-American. And you know, I remember Trump as a candidate in 2016 being interviewed about American foreign policy, and he said, you know, we're just too predictable. You know, we've got to be more unpredictable. And at the time I thought, man, wrong answer. You know, I think we ought to be very predictable. But the fact that Trump was unpredictable, I think it worked to his advantage. So I think it's kind of a blend. I think you got to keep your adversaries guessing. I mean, the fact that he unleashed cruise missiles when President Xi was sitting across the table from in Mar-a-Lago in response to chemical weapons being used in Syria. By the way, one thing I have to say about Trump too, the story about the Iranian downing of drones, or our drone, and you know the drum beat for war. You got to respond. You got to revenge. And you were right up to the moment of launch, and Trump finally asked the question. Well, okay, first of all, how much does that drone cost? It was a few $1 million. So how many Iranians are going to die? And I heard a low estimate. I actually asked Trump about this. You know, it was greater than that. It was more than 150. And to Trump's credit, he said, I don't think that drone's worth that kind of life. I really do think, as much as people fearmonger about Trump, I think he's probably the president least likely to get us into war. I think he's very anti-war. And that's not a bad thing in a president.
And Mario, just to respond quickly, the only evidence we have is this. Trump has said 1 million times, I'm exaggerating, let's get us out of NATO, NATO's worthless, blah, 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 blah. Trump has made clear that he wants out of NATO. He wants
bluffing?
America out of NATO. Who knows? Again, he has said it constantly. The other known fact we know is Donald Trump has never, ever publicly criticized Vladimir Putin. In fact, he's gone out of his way for years to do the exact opposite. That's all we know.
So Senator,
Because he doesn't want to go to war with them.
Senator, President Biden has repeatedly said that the U.S. would, quote, defend every inch of NATO territory. That includes Russia's neighbors, which are Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Norway, and recently Finland and Sweden. Do you think Trump also shares that position and would defend every inch of NATO territory from a potential Russian incursion, which Congressman is concerned about?
So that is obviously our commitment under
Article 5.
Article 5. And, every president has to make that commitment. And I don't disagree with that. What is interesting is the Budapest Memorandum, I think, is widely misinterpreted. The signatures of that were the U.S., UK, I think Northern Ireland, Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And all that we committed to was if there is some kind of invasion, we would seek immediate Security Council action to provide assistance. And we would consult with those signatories. That's all we can. We didn't say we're going to go to war. We sure didn't say we're going to go to war with Russia. We didn't make the commitment we made under Article 5, okay, under the NATO Charter. So we've gone way beyond what we committed to in terms of that Budapest agreement, and it's Russia that broke that. I mean, how do you handle a situation where one of the signatures who assured their territorial integrity? That was Russia that blew that.
Russia did break it, and
but
again,
they broke that back in
the language
Crimea.
is the language at Budapest, but we did agree to help with any security assistance if anything
we said
happens.
we'd go to the Security Council to get them to act to provide assistance.
But Mario, to your question, Trump's in the White House. Putin invades Finland or Sweden, I have no doubt that every other NATO country would step up. Technically,
that's why I don't think Putin would do it. I don't think he's that crazy.
They don't have to with troops. I think if Donald Trump's in the White House, he'd do whatever he could not to have America not to do anything.
Do you think, Senator, do you think actually, I'll put in some context, Trump said he would solve the war in Ukraine in 24 hours if elected president. How could Trump achieve this? Would he accept Ukrainian military neutrality so they don't join NATO, which according to the Wall Street Journal was a condition, as we've talked earlier, in the peace negotiations?
That you'll have to ask President Trump.
Well,
I think that's high expectations.
No,
do you think he'll send
in business? My approach is always under promise, over deliver. I think Trump has always taken the opposite approach. Over promise, and
Mario,
we'll see whether or not we can deliver.
Do you think he'll send more aid to Ukraine if he's president?
I can't predict.
No, the answer is no. And by the way, Ron's being much more diplomatic about Donald Trump. It's idiocy. But how could you do it in 24 hours? In Trump's feeble mind, he probably thinks the only way I can do it is to bring Ukraine to their knees. And that's what he would try to do.
Congressman, you said the following, quote, there is a pro-Putin faction in the Republican Party. Can you elaborate on this point?
Yeah, look, I think, and you and I have never talked about this, I'm a former Republican. Ron and I are both Tea Party guys. I'm still a proud Tea Party guy. There is an element of the Republican Party base that actively embraces authoritarianism.
Can you list some names?
In the voting base, okay, among Republican voters, it's a sizable, passionate part of the Republican base. I mean, I could give you one name, Tucker Carlson, who speaks to that base. And that then naturally gets them to have fond opinions of Orban and Erdogan and people like this. We've heard from representatives, not Senator Johnson, who's been very principled with his stance on this issue, but some of my former Republican colleagues in the House have openly said, have openly cheerleaded for Putin. Marjorie Taylor Greene and others have openly rooted for Putin. Tucker Carlson said he's rooting for Putin. Tucker Carlson speaks for a lot of Republican voters when he said that. It's a real concern. And I think that translates into support for Putin.
Let me just quick say, so Ambassador Huntsman invited me to go to Moscow with a delegation to talk to members of the Duma to try and develop relationships. That was okay. So then I get called Russian run. I'm banned from Russia.
Not you, not me.
Okay, but I will say, I think when you take a look at the dystopia within American big cities, when you look at the rampant crime, you've got prosecutors that aren't prosecuting things. Now, I thought an interesting part, again, I thought Tucker's interview.
Don't you say what I think you're going to say.
I thought Tucker's interview was pretty interesting. Okay, again, taking everything with a grain of salt. But I thought the little video he did going down to the Moscow subway, built by Stalin, 70, 80 years ago, looks like a cathedral. Muscovites can go down there and feel pretty secure. So how free are you when you can't walk the streets of America? So I think it's not loving Putin, it's not loving Orban, it's looking at cultures that aren't letting their cultures circle the drain, that support families, that actually uphold the rule of law and keep their citizens safe, that actually respect their sovereign state. They have closed borders. They don't open up the borders to millions of people, including military-aged men. So I think it's that juxtaposition, it's that comparison to what is happening to America, and you're looking for a different governing philosophy that's going to secure our borders, keep us safe.
So, the senator makes a great point. This is what drives a lot of the Republican voters to say, this is part of Trump's great appeal. I want a strong man to get me a lot of what Ron Johnson.
It's not necessarily strong. It's the result.
Bull crap. It's the
result.
Is Putin's a strong man? Orban's a strong man?
No, we want safe streets. We want to be able to go down to the subway and have it look nice and not graffiti every place or worse. Okay, not looking over your shoulder all the time.
Okay, but
they see that other areas of the world. And yeah, there are strongmen there. So it's not an appeal to the strongmen. It's what is the safety that's available in some of these places, because we're not guaranteeing it here.
A lot of Republican voters will say it's going to take a strong man to get that for me. And
no,
Ron,
I don't agree.
I know you didn't mean this.
What it needs defeating radical leftism is what we have to do.
Yeah, but we
have to defeat people like Biden. Biden's a disaster. Biden is a disaster.
Tucker Carlson went to Moscow and said, "This is better than any city in America." He said that. You don't agree. Please tell me you don't agree with that. He said,
I saw the video of the subway, and it's probably nicer than any most subways in America.
It's a better city than any city in America.
No, I'm talking about the video of the subway, and that's demonstrably true.
Okay, a cleaner subway. You would acknowledge
probably a safer subway too than many cities in America.
Would you acknowledge that people in Russia are less free than we are here?
Yeah. Listen,
thank you.
We're the good guys, and by the way, Tucker said that too. We're the good guys.
Ron, you do, and I appreciate that from you. But no, that was a PR trip for Putin. Period.
Senator, I want to talk about a separate concern that the EU has if Trump becomes president. They call it Trump-proofing. So essentially, they're taking precautionary measures in case Trump wins and the US becomes more isolationist.
What do you think?
Is that a valid concern? How could a Trump presidency impact the Ukraine war, impact NATO, and impact the state of America standing in the world with their allies and with their enemies?
Well, I think there is something called Trump derangement syndrome, which is real. Okay, it just is. I'm not a confidant of Trump. I've spent a little bit of time with him. He's a smart guy. Okay. Quite honestly, when I disagree with him, I kind of scratch my head and go, okay, what am I seeing that he's seeing? He relies on a lot of gut instinct. Okay.
You haven't endorsed Trump, as far as I
don't endorse candidates. I let Republican primary voters decide that, and then I'll support the candidate. It looks like it'll be Trump.
Congressman, your thoughts on the concern that the EU has in what they call Trump-proofing?
Did you say the EU?
EU, yes, Europe.
Oh,
EU EU, at least America's allies.
No, look, I think our allies around the world are extremely concerned, and I'm understating it, that he may be back in the White House. Because I think Trump's record shows, and I think he's made clear, that he is much more comfortable siding up with and palling around with dictators around the world and giving our allies the back of his hand. And I hammer this. NATO is a force for good. We have a guy running for office who has pledged to get us out of it and or disband it. Boy, vote on that, America.
Gentlemen, the state of the war is not where I would have expected it. on the first day of the invasion or in the first year of the invasion. I think we'd all agree on that. Essentially, and Senator, that's for you, Zelensky's top aide himself admitted that Ukraine would lose the war if aid stops, if US aid stops. Without the US, Ukraine cannot pay their bills, they can't pay their teachers, their doctors, not even the soldiers fighting the war. And the EU, as I said earlier, cannot fill that void. The industrial capacity of the EU and the US, as you mentioned, at least for shells, combined is already struggling to compete with Russia's. Most of Ukraine's air defense, which is paramount and struggling right now, it's all from the US, or most of it's from the US. Considering these facts, how is it even possible the US stops or even reduces military aid? How could peace negotiations succeed under those circumstances, which, Congressman, you've asked earlier?
Well, what I would say is that the Biden administration and people who support the funding, want to get it, secure the border. It's literally that simple. Secure the border. But Biden doesn't want to do that. So again, you can't separate the two issues. They became tied, and it's a very valid point.
They should be tied, do you think?
Yes. Before we send money to secure Ukraine's border, it's a very valid political point.
If you believe that,
but reality points say we better secure ours first.
I do believe that. If you
point.
believe that, Ron, and I respect you for believing that, and I wasn't a huge fan of the border bill, then if Republicans really believe that, and Biden's desperate to get aid to Ukraine, and they got to be tied together, then why did Republicans just walk away from that bill? Hold on, let me finish, my friend. Why didn't they sit down with Biden over in one day and hammer out a better border bill?
McConnell blew it. That bill was worse than doing nothing.
Then
the Supreme Court says the current law exudes deference to the president. Nobody was looking for an immigration bill. The nasty part of that bill was not to the 5,000 average day threshold where it's mandatory to stop processing asylum claims. It was the 4,000 person threshold. Because that implies that the president doesn't have the authority. He does. So the minute you codify that, you have weakened that authority, and that authority then only lasted for 3 years.
I agree.
So it was way worse than doing nothing. But that was McConnell's fault.
I agree with almost
completely.
I agree.
And the other point is, Biden wasn't negotiating, Democrats weren't negotiating in good faith to secure the border. They were looking for political cover, and McConnell gave it to them.
I'll be 10 seconds. I agree with almost everything you're saying about that border bill. But you Republicans have tied no aid to Ukraine unless we take care of the border. So what are you Republicans doing? Because you've walked away from the border bill now. What about aid to Ukraine?
So again, Republicans have H.R. 2. Again, all Biden has to do
is pass that.
Pass that would do it. That would absolutely pass.
Do you think, Ron,
that would absolutely pass? I mean, the House would pass it.
Do you think the House will pass standalone aid for Ukraine? You don't?
It's a possibility. It only happen under suspension.
I think they will.
Only under suspension. They'll have to do
at this point, Mario, at this point, look, Joe Biden has done, and Ron and I would agree, a lousy job on the border for 3 years. But it's gotten to the point now Donald Trump doesn't want any victory for Biden on the border. Period. So that's why they're holding up Ukraine.
Trump had no impact.
Oh, baloney, my friend.
None.
Baloney.
None.
Baloney.
That bill killed itself. That bill killed itself.
Gentlemen, I want to go back to the current state of the war and Russia. We've talked about the constraints when it comes to US and European capacity. But the EU just approved another 50 billion euros. The US is on track to pass a few more tens of billions, 60 billion more or less. Senator, with your experience and knowledge about Russia and Ukraine, do you think Russia can sustain their astronomical military spending to compete with those bills and with that?
Russia's stronger 2 years into this war.
No.
Yes.
No.
Now, the military there's been a lot of damage to that, but their industrial base, they're gearing up. They're producing more missiles. They're selling oil. The oil price went from, depending on which one you're looking at, like 60 up to 100, now settle around 80. I think that's a Brent crude. I'm not an oil guy. But, the sanctions haven't worked. I mean, basically, Putin was taunting us, and you have to admit he's making a point. Fair. We deny him access to the dollar, so we just start selling in rubles and the Chinese yuan, weakening America's position as the world's reserve currency, which is our greatest liability. You're $34, $35 trillion in debt. The only way that hasn't blown up in our face right now is because of the world's reserve currency, and all these sanctions are weakening our position with the dollar.
Respectfully, Senator, it's not fair to say that the sanctions haven't worked. The Russian economy has shrunk 2 years in a row.
No, it shrunk 1 year, now it's growing.
22 and 23, it shrunk. Inflation is through the roof. Hundreds of thousands of Russians and Russian men have left the country. The military has taken a huge hit. Russia has taken a hit, Ron. Sanctions alone, there's no history where sanctions alone defeat someone like a Putin. It's got to be sanctions plus military.
I've heard, our U.S. officials saying one of the war aims now is to continue to degrade Russian military. I think it's a bad war aim.
What would you say?
I just think that inflames the world. I think that just.
What would you do then?
Would you say this is a bigger focus of the West and the U.S. rather than finding peace to keep weakening Russia, or at least that was the plan early on?
I would try and reduce tensions in the world. I know it sounds Pollyannish, but I would try and reduce tensions. I would quit trying to ramp them up. I think there's too many people within our foreign policy of the administrations that are just ramping up tensions.
So do you think they're focusing more on ramping up tensions to weaken Russia and essentially using Zelensky and Ukraine as a tool to achieve that?
Oh, I think the Ukrainian people definitely been used as a tool of U.S. foreign policy. This at this point is a proxy war. And I don't like that.
Mario, the one interesting difference between the two of us is when you ask that question, and I appreciate you keep asking it, what would you do now? I've got a clear answer. Ramp it up militarily, kick Putin in the butt to try to bring him to his knees. It may not work. Ron, who I respect the hell out of, hasn't been able to answer that question. Ron's talking about easing tensions in Kumbaya.
I did answer it. And
what
again,
is it?
You need a strategy to show Putin that this is a long-term stock. But we don't have that. No. We don't have that with Biden.
Yes.
He's won
So
$60 billion, and we'll be sitting here a year later and 3 years into a bloody stalemate that we've made no progress.
Does that mean, Ron, because in your eyes Biden doesn't have a strategy, then no aid for Ukraine?
Yeah, he has no strategy.
He has no strategy.
Aid.
So the result then is no aid.
Until we secure our border.
Let me give you, Congressman, let me give you another example. Senator Mark Kelly said the following: there will be a clear winner and loser in this conflict. Everybody needs to understand that. There will be an end to this, and we need to be sure Ukraine wins, which I'm sure you'll agree with that quote. So the Fox reporter then asked, I'm still short on the specifics of what victory looks like. Yeah. And Senator Kelly said, well, let's start with them not losing. Congressman, how would you define a Ukrainian win? Because based on this answer and other things that were said by other senators, there doesn't seem to be a strategy.
It's a fair point, Mario. My criticism of Ron Johnson and people who think like he does, they really don't answer the question, what would you do? My side really doesn't have an answer for what does victory look like. It's a fair point. Again, to me, victory looks like giving Ukraine what they need to push them back to everything but Crimea and the East, push them back hard, put Russia in a position where they're so weakened militarily that they cannot go into Ukraine again, and they want to sit at the table. To me, that would be victory.
But you'd agree?
It's not going to happen.
So what would be your counter to that?
Then what do we?
Again, it's not going to happen. Again, I support the first $40 billion.
I know
and Biden completely blew it. I mean, it hasn't worked. We're 2 years into it. So this is just kind of going round and round. I don't think you're going to get any different answers out of this. Again, I'm showing my cards too. I'm voting against the $60 billion until Biden secures the border. I'm using that as leverage, and we should use it as leverage.
So Congressman, you said in March 2022 that Biden was doing, quote, a masterful job leading the world's response to the war in Ukraine. And look where we are today. After all this destruction, peace seems further away than ever. Do you stand by the statement?
Oh, absolutely. Diplomatically, again, Ron said it's a low bar. I'll take that as a compliment for Biden. Biden has done, Russia invades, Biden leads and brings together a worldwide coalition of free peoples to defend Ukraine. I think he's done a masterful job doing that. If Ukraine cannot win this war on their own, If we keep doing what we're doing and giving them a little bit here and there, it will be a stalemate forever. If you'd like to end that, I think we have to ratchet what we give them.
But that's been the strategy, and that's what Biden will continue to do.
But we haven't ratcheted
He's never given the weapons to really win the war. He just hasn't done it. And I don't expect him to do it. So why?
But if he did,
why give him another $60 billion to do the same thing?
If he did, you'd approve the $60 billion. If he said,
I haven't seen the strategy.
But
that's hypothetical. I actually have to see the strategy,
Senator,
and I want to see a secure border here in America.
and by the way, Mario, one more point. Again, Zelensky would have been gone. Ukraine would have been conquered in a weekend, in a month, in 6 months, if the alliance had to come together. So hell yeah, I give Biden a lot of credit.
But what she said was easy to achieve considering Russia's invasion.
The Ukrainians pushed back Russians. Now they had help in terms of training, in terms of exactly how to fight back on that. But aid, other than what we originally provided, that didn't start flowing for a while. So it was the fact that Zelensky said, no, I don't want your plane trip out of here, and it was the courage of the Ukrainian people, which is again why Americans are so sympathetic with the Ukrainian people.
And that's why this isn't Vietnam or Afghanistan, because we're not talking about Americans on the front lines. Ukraine is fighting this thing, and the alliance has been supporting them. And it would be an absolute shame at this point. Again, at this point, maybe at the beginning, Ron, we wouldn't have gone down this road. But we're on this road now, and I don't see how you pull off it.
So I'm going to go through some of the questions by the audience in the comments. Congressman, I'll ask that one for you, because I think, Senator, you've kind of hinted at it. At what point will you negotiate with Putin?
I'd negotiate with Putin when we've gotten to a point where we've pushed him back on the 18 or 19% of Ukraine he's already taken, beyond Crimea. At that point, I'd push him back, and I'd say, let's sit down.
Senator, same question for you.
I would have been talking to him a long time ago.
I do want to move to the U.S. standing in the world, and I'll go through more audience questions. There are fears, Senator, I'll go to you. There are fears that a loss in Ukraine would lead to a rise in the influence of what NATO's former chief calls the axis of autocracy. It reminds me of the axis, George Bush's axis of evil. So that's China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Is this a valid concern?
That's what's already happened. I mean, Russia is far closer to China. China's buying the oil. Russia's, obtaining weapons from North Korea and from Iran. So this has solidified that axis of evil, if you want to call it that. I mean, all the sanctions, the war has actually helped put that coalition together.
Congressman, same question for you. House Speaker Mike Johnson said that Russia, China, and Iran are, quote, the new axis of evil. Do you agree?
Yeah, nothing would make China smile more than Ukraine losing, the United States walking away, and Putin winning. Nothing would help China more than that. And by the way, watch out Taiwan.
Senator, a question for you from Twitter account Folding Pattern. If Trump wins in 2024, will he be able, I know we've touched on it briefly, will he be able to keep his promise to end the war, not in 24 hours, in a few weeks? And what would an agreement look like under Trump?
It just may take a new face and new relationship to try and do something like this. Maybe too late for Biden to ever do this. But sometimes an election, another person in that position might be able to negotiate something.
Whoever's in the White House, Mario, I hope that they will support and keep the United States in NATO. Keep NATO as unified as it is right now.
But you're talking about strategy, and I know, Senator, that's a very important point for you. Congressman, U.S. allies, and Senator, I want to ask you that same question. You got Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have both rolled the red carpet for Putin, and they haven't sanctioned Russia. Again, these are U.S. allies. Why is that? And doesn't that demonstrate a weakening United States?
No, and I think we should have been applying more pressure on Saudi Arabia and some of our other allies. Nothing would hurt the status of the United States at this point more. And again, we can argue about Budapest, but we made a pledge. To walk away from that pledge and not assist Ukraine,
we've gone way beyond that pledge.
We can argue.
We've gone way beyond that pledge.
We can argue about what Putin might do beyond Ukraine, but to just give him Ukraine, to walk
again,
away
you
now.
have to look at the results. I mean, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. Now they're selling oil in the yuan. That's not helpful. Again, that weakens America. Again, what all this is doing is weakening America.
No, but NATO, bigger, stronger, and more unified.
We're not getting out of NATO. I don't believe the president has the ability to get us out of NATO.
But I'm just saying that strengthens America. The way we've all come together to help Ukraine, that strengthens America.
Unless you misuse it and start, all of a sudden you have threats of nuclear war. That doesn't strengthen us.
Biden and Ron talks about strategy. My strategy from the beginning with this money would have been to gone bigger and faster with the weapons they really needed from the beginning.
He's still the general.
Right, and you talk strategy. That's what I wish we'd do now.
But then why isn't Biden? That's a question from the audience. Why then isn't Biden speaking to Putin? And should he be sitting on the table with Putin?
Oh, absolutely, not yet. There should be no discussions with Putin right now, no negotiation with Putin right now. And again, they invaded a sovereign country. He's grabbed an extra 19% of that country. Okay, stop, time out.
So this war never ends. Biden continues to spoon feed Ukraine to keep this bloody stalemate. No, that's what's going to happen.
Then okay,
that's
Ron,
what's going to happen.
Fair, and then
that's what's going to happen.
Okay, and then that makes me look bad. Okay, but then then just give Russia the extra 19% of Ukraine now. Just give it to them.
No, I'm not saying that.
Then what does a settlement now?
What
does a settlement
what
now
I'm
look
saying
like?
is this administration wants $60 billion. I'm going, okay, consider it. Show me a strategy and secure our border first.
Ron,
That's not that heavy a lift.
Senator,
By the way, what I suggested in that process is make the funding contingent on actually securing the border. Month by month, $5 billion a month, over 12 months, give him 12 months to secure the border and see the numbers.
It's
very doable.
Mario asked me if Biden should sit down with Putin right now and work out an agreement. I said no, because he shouldn't get what he just stole. If you were sitting down with Putin right now, what you want a ceasefire, you want a cessation of the war, then what's the agreement?
That's an impossible question to ask.
Well, come on.
No, it is. I mean, what's your negotiating strategy?
No. What is the agreement? If you say stop the fighting now, Russia's grabbed an extra 19% of Ukraine. Okay, what do you do with that?
Would you say?
Again, I don't see the situation getting better.
Would you? I'll try. I know it's difficult to just give out your entire strategy, but just broadly speaking, do you think it should be at least a point of discussion for Russia to keep the 18 whatever percent of territory they invaded? Generally speaking, should that be on the table?
What you need to do is show Putin in terms of the kind of weaponry you're going to provide, the type of, what the coalition is going to do. This is going to be a bloody guerrilla war for years, and it's not in your best interest to do that. So you got to demonstrate that, show that to Putin. It's what we should have been doing over the last 2 years, for sure over the last year, and we haven't done it.
But here we are.
Biden isn't capable of doing it. So again, as somebody who has to vote on this stuff, they're not paying for it. They're not securing the border. I'm voting no.
Ron, hold on. Simple, straight question. I'll rephrase Mario's. Would you let Russia keep what they've gotten if fighting stopped tomorrow? Yes or no?
That's a very hard question to answer. I would, obviously, I think you've got to be talking to the Ukrainians as well. Okay, and involve those kind of discussions as well.
Agreed.
And part of the reason I think it's not a bad thing that Zelensky understands that he doesn't have an open checkbook here in the United States Congress, because at this point in time, Zelensky has to reclaim the attitude he had when I met with him shortly after his inauguration, saying he wanted to do a peace deal with Putin because he knew he couldn't dislodge Putin from Crimea and the part of eastern Ukraine he already had.
Respectfully.
Can he dislodge him from the extra 18%? I highly doubt it.
Respectfully, my good friend won't answer that question. My answer would be no. I wouldn't stop fighting right now and let Putin keep what he got.
But then, Congressman, then question for you then. Zelensky, I think it's illegal to even negotiate with Putin right now. Zelensky said he would not negotiate with Putin or not agree to any peace deal that doesn't involve all of Ukraine's territory being returned to Ukraine, including Crimea.
And I agree.
And under those circumstances, then, how can we reach a peace deal?
And I agreed, Mario. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's Ukraine's public posture, because to say less at this point, Ron talks about negotiation, would completely undermine what... There's no leader in the West that thinks Russia is going to give back Crimea and give back the East. I'm talking about the land they've grabbed the last 2 years. That's what's on the table right now.
But do you think the U.S. should then oust Putin from power, considering Zelensky doesn't even want to negotiate? We need Ukraine on the negotiating table. They will not talk to Putin.
Ron and I would agree on this. It's not our job to oust other leaders. It was a mistake to invade Iraq and try to implant our own government. That's not what we do or should do.
Senator, another quick question for you. We don't have much time, so we'll just read out a few more audience questions here. Do you think the U.S. Congress will ultimately pass another round of U.S. aid to Ukraine, whether or not you will personally vote for it?
Well, again, it would easily pass if Biden would secure the border. It would easily pass. I can't predict whether the House will be able to put in a discharge petition and pass it with 2/3 majority, possibly. But again, it would easily pass if Biden would secure the border.
Congressman, another audience question here. Do you think Russia is guilty of, quote, genocide in Ukraine, as a lot of people are labeling it? And how does that compare with allegations that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza?
Completely, Russia is committing genocide. They've kidnapped hundreds and thousands of Ukrainian children. They have targeted Ukrainian citizens, civilians, and killed tens of thousands of them. It's an utter genocide because Putin wants Ukraine to be Russia. No, Israel is not committing genocide. Israel is doing the exact opposite. What Hamas did on October 7th is genocide, trying to kill Israeli civilians. It's in the Hamas charter to destroy the state of Israel. That's genocide.
Gentlemen, another tough question, and then we'll go to final closing questions. In his annual statement, Senator, Putin warned again for the millionth time of a nuclear war. It seems that the West keeps assuming he's bluffing. How long can we keep pushing this until we eventually get to what no one likes to talk about, and that's a nuclear conflict?
I don't want to push it to that point. John F. Kennedy, in a pretty famous speech to American University, just laid out the point that we really do need to understand the perspective our adversaries. Doesn't say you have to agree with their perspective, doesn't say you have to believe everything they say, but you should try and understand the perspective of your adversaries. And again, I think I can see why Putin has some legitimate concerns in terms of how we have expanded NATO, the CIA stations, all that type of thing. I would say some of that stuff is just unwarranted. So you have to understand that perspective.
Congressman, you said that we should not even be negotiating with Putin. Putin has moved nuclear warheads a few months ago to Belarus. Obviously, he faced a mutiny. He's warned him, and Medvedev and others have warned of a nuclear conflict. If we continue this war, if we don't negotiate with Putin, is there an increasing risk that the outcome could be significantly worse from what we have today?
Mario, Putin's a bully. He's a thug and a dictator. He only responds to strength. If you want to avoid any nuclear confrontation with Russia, you have to do whatever you can to help Ukraine keep a semblance of their sovereignty.
And I would argue American strength starts by securing our border, stop the massive deficit spending, end our war on fossil fuel, artificially driving up the cost of energy. I mean, that is American strength. That is what our enemies are perceiving. That's why they're on the move.
Yeah, but Mario, again, agree with a lot of that. By the way, we're producing more oil now than we ever have. Ukraine's waiting for help. And so if you want to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, which isn't going to happen for the next 3 years, all of this stuff, because Ron Johnson wants all of these other things.
I'm saying secure the border. That ought to be a no-brainer.
Okay.
Gentlemen, it was an incredible discussion. I think there's a lot more that you agree on versus disagreeing on, and that's an important message to the audience in this polarized world that we live in. But I do want to end this discussion with in my opinion, difficult question, and I'd love a pragmatic response to this. Congressman, I'm going to go with you first. Where do you see Ukraine, U.S. involvement in Ukraine and Russia by the end of this year, considering the current circumstances?
I don't know how, Mario, pragmatically, and I hear what Ron says. Aid to Ukraine would pass tomorrow. Half of Republicans in the House want it. All the Democrats would support it. It's a third of the Republican Party that's keeping it away. I don't know how they can continue to do that. as Ukrainian men and women die struggling to even have ammo. So I would expect that to pass. I would hope, we talk strategy, that Biden then will say, screw it, we're gonna go bigger and even stronger to try to bring Putin to the knees, to the negotiating table. The final thing I'll say is that we don't talk about the moral case. There's good and evil in the world. Putin's evil. Hamas is evil. The Israeli government, the American government, not perfect, flawed. But our governments are not evil. The Ukrainian government, burgeoning democracy, trying to be free, still too much corruption. The Ukrainian government isn't evil. This is a vivid example of an evil man who invaded a country in Europe. If we can't be a part of trying to stop that, then what good are we?
But Congressman, I'm going to add one more question to this before going to Senator, because you've added those buckets and that labeling, good versus evil, which I generally try to avoid. But in foreign policy terms, I want to use another label that a lot of people use. How do you define being, and that question will go to you right after, Senator, how do you define being a neoconservative versus an isolationist today in the modern Republican Party? And where would you place yourself on that spectrum? Where would you place people like Trump, Nikki Haley, Mitch McConnell, Speaker Mike Johnson on that spectrum?
No, and that's why I was laughing with Ron about this. Ron and I'm not a neocon. Like, I'm not like your friend Lindsey Graham, who wants America to be everywhere. I wasn't like John McCain, who wanted America to fight everywhere. I'm closer to an isolationist. I want America to have the biggest, baddest military in the world, and when our national interests are threatened, we respond. I just believe in the case of Ukraine and NATO and Europe, our national interests are threatened. I'm no neocon at all.
Senator, that same question for you, and then the final closing question is, how do you see this war ending, if at all, in the next 10 months?
First of all, I don't think that America can be the world's policeman. Okay. I think when we have an opportunity to provide stability, we should, when it's in our national interest. I think we need to be very careful in terms of pushing people, poking sticks in people's eye. I think our position ought to be trying to reduce tensions in the world. Unfortunately, I don't like the reality in Ukraine. I hate it. Putin, I'll repeat myself, Putin is an evil war criminal. Again, genocide, I would say war crimes. I mean, we're seeing war crimes being committed here. And I think what's most likely to happen is we'll continue this bloody stalemate. There'll be trench warfare back and forth, with artillery shells, and Russia can fire about 10,000 a day, and Ukraine can fire about 2. So they're definitely outgunned there, and that's not going to change anytime soon, because we just don't have the production capability. And at the same time, we're going to continue to be invaded, and that's what's happening. The southern border invaded. You're seeing camps of Chinese military-age men in the Darien Gap. You're seeing, millions of gotaways. We have no idea really who most of the 6 million people are that have come to this country. We'll see continued deterioration of America as well. So we got a lot of problems. There are no easy answers here whatsoever. So that's why, I'm forced to vote. I've got to put myself on the record, and I just made the decision that before I would support another $60 billion for Ukraine, I would demand that we secure the border, and that continues to be my position. Like it or hate it.
I want to compliment him and you, Mario. I'll just say one more thing. As a former member of the House, members of the House and Senate should be big enough and mature enough to have an up or down vote on Ukraine, damn it, an up or down vote on Israel, and an up or down vote on the border. I hate it when Congress ties all this crap together. Final point I'll make is thank you for doing this. This is really important to have people with differing viewpoints talk about this stuff. And Ron, thank you for doing this. I mean it.
No, thank you.
I agree. And just for the audience, I've spent a lot of time trying to bring all sides together, and I've had in some of the shows people on the ground on the Russian side and on the ground on the Ukrainian side on stage together. We've had people from Hamas and people from Israel on stage together, and we're obviously trying to achieve this here, even though you guys agree on a lot more than people would have expected.
But
It's because neither one of us is a neocon.
the world shouldn't be as polarized as it is, and I hope this demonstrates that. ZeroHedge, thank you for organizing this discussion, and for the audience, thank you for tuning in. Senator, Congressman, it was a real pleasure having you both. It was
Thanks,
incredible.
Mario. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.